Similarly, in the United States, their notion of grand challenge is all very technologically framed. In the UK, the science establishment argues in terms of an analogous program to the Apollo program, which is again more research and development, new, far from market energy technologies. So it's energy production technologies based on scientific investments, and this is the Royal Society's position. Basically, invest in science and innovation on excellent people, and they will understand the global challenges that they need to devote themselves to. Don't get too involved from a public policy perspective in that. And just as an example of what I would say was the negative consequences of that narrow preoccupation with a science and technology-based model, Nesta did a survey of regional and city innovation strategies in 2007. Of 9 regional strategies, 8 included biotechnology and health sciences as the priority area. I mean, completely unrealistic notion that every region in the UK can establish some sort of competitive advantage based on that scientific area. Okay, how are we doing? Right. All right, now let's look at the problem that we're trying to deal with, because if it's just an argument about wind power or carbon capture and storage, which people get very exercised about, and there is a technical community which is quite difficult to enter because these people are well versed in all the technical feasibility, the economics and so on. The point is, if you think of it in terms of a system, the global energy system, then just these one or two examples of energy production technologies, I mean, are at that end of this system. If you come through the system to the final services, you can frame the innovation challenge in a completely different way, which is about the emissions arising from these few number of fundamental end-use categories: passenger transport, freight transport, structure, the buildings that we have, sustenance, our food and nutrition system, hygiene, clean water, thermal comfort, keeping warm enough or cool enough, communication and illumination. So the whole of this complicated global energy system needn't be talked about in terms of different energy production technologies. It can be talked about in terms of energy efficiencies and lower carbon emissions for these types of end-use categories. Now, there is a very interesting paper in the current edition of Nature Climate Change which has actually measured the innovation investments in what it calls either energy supply technologies or end-use technologies. And the table on the left is the inputs to the innovation system, where the brown bar is the supply side energy creation technologies, and you can see that it varies, but I mean these are sort of the research investments. You know, 80 to 90% of all public R&D investments are going into new energy supply technologies, very little going into end-use, user-involved energy efficiency schemes. Yet if you actually look at real investments in technologies and infrastructure, which is this output chart, the vast majority of real-world investments are going into much more end-use, system-oriented infrastructural projects. So there's extraordinary mismatch between how the input side of the innovation system is identifying priorities compared to how the world of practice actually identifies those priorities. So, in political terms then, it seems to me the question one has to ask is, well, one explanation is that the only technically serious options are those about wind power. and carbon capture and storage, but actually there's nothing very certain about those. I mean, carbon capture and storage still hasn't really been implemented or shown to be a viable commercial option. Nuclear power, Japan and Germany have just bailed out of that as a path. Britain is sticking on in there. Hitachi has just decided to invest in the UK. So it's not that the energy supply things are that certain. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. But actually, a lot of these more distributed end-use systems have quite serious technical constituencies associated with them and show that they are actually quite serious contenders. Local waste into biogas, smart grids, microgeneration, combined heat and power, multimodal transport. So it's not that these aren't serious options, but it seems to me they have to have a voice. And unless you've got a voice and an alliance and a narrative which is as powerful as the science establishment and incumbent business alliance and their science push narrative, then essentially the old model continues to prevail. And this is where it seems to me that we need to acknowledge that if there is going to be a constituency to articulate a more distributed socio-technical model of innovation, it's quite likely to be from what you would call place-based actors rather than conventional businesses, because they're systemic innovations. So you need to identify social actors who actually have an explicit responsibility and interest in those type of system innovations, mobility and household living, for example. And that is different to traditional product-focused innovators. The Centro Transport Authority in the Midlands, which is a sort of hybrid public-private institution, its day-to-day existence is the mobility around the West Midlands region and ensuring that it works and making decisions on investment in the future. Jaguar Land Rover in Birmingham produces a product which it wants to sell into the market. It doesn't actually have a direct stake or role in terms of the mobility system. So it seems to me, if we're saying that we're looking at some sort of transformative innovation, which is more likely to be based on socio-technical systems, then we need to look at the actors who could well fulfill that sort of role. And that's where I think regional players and municipal and city players are those who have the real responsibilities for transport, housing, waste and energy systems. And so if one's going to resolve that deadlock between the old model and the new, then you have to have some new political constituency with those new actors, which is promoting that new narrative. And interestingly, over the past couple of years, those institutions who are responsible for climate change policy are, of course, becoming more and more interested in this. So the establishment of the UK Climate Change Act, the Committee on Climate Change, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which only goes back, what, 3 or 4 years, is created a new actor within the national policy system who actually need to reduce emissions by certain targets over the next 5 years or 10 years. So they may well be strongly influenced by the science business network and their model, but actually they're also fairly sceptical if it's not delivering. And so interestingly, they recently published, just this year, a whole document on how local authorities could play a much bigger role in that process. And inevitably linked to the role of new place-based system innovation-oriented actors is a different type of knowledge. I mean, this isn't a spin-off from a high-tech bio-lab. This is going to be more integrated and practice-based knowledge. It's going to be based on learning by doing, innovative approaches to mobility, experimentation, just trying different things, which is much more feasible at a local level than at a national level. Any suggestion of national policy subject to endless desk-based cost-benefit analysis to show that it probably can't be guaranteed to deliver what it promises, and it's very difficult for national governments to experiment. They find it very hard. Whereas actually a local authority has got much more space to do that. Okay, so let me just finish. So I suppose what I'm currently doing in the main project I'm involved in is actually trying to contribute to the emergence of this new constituency of place-based system innovation actors, and I'm doing that through the European Institute for Innovation and Technology, which was established in 2008, which has created a number of European-wide knowledge and innovation communities, one of which is the Climate Kit, which is what I'm involved with. And this has a dual network. There's a network of leading academic institutes, Imperial College, ETH, Zurich, and so on. And there is also a network of cities. And the cities are ordinary cities. They're not the cities which have the top universities in them. They are normal places. Birmingham, Frankfurt, Wrocław, Valencia. So it's based on the notion that unless you are getting system innovation and transition in ordinary cities, then there is really not much prospect of achieving those ambitious goals. And so I'm working with these cities across Europe to try and pioneer a new notion of what that type of transformative innovation can be. And it is interesting. I mean, I showed you that earlier bar chart, which shows this odd contrast between the balance of research investments, which are overwhelmingly towards energy supply, with sort of actual infrastructural investments, which are much more use-oriented. Well, this is these ordinary places, and we just did a trawl of existing active low-carbon innovation projects in those cities, and found 76 projects with an investment of 1,500 million euros actually underway at the present time. So there's quite a lot going on, but is it actually going on in the sense that I'm talking about, of a notion of the city authorities being system innovators as part of a transition? And the fact is, not really. And so part of this project is to try and influence and change that approach. Okay, so basically we define then within these cities platforms which are broad areas defined by end use, then arenas within those which are specific types of socio-technical system transformation which are possible. And then we are interested in developing the idea of transition experiments within those arenas. And an experiment is like an innovation project, but with some much more reflexive awareness that it's engaged in the societal challenge and engaged in system innovation. Because many of those projects actually are just viewed by the city authorities as projects. We've got a project on transport, or we've got a project on waste. And so we're working with them to say, well, actually, there are different ways of thinking about these projects, which actually add up to a more interesting part of socio-technical transition. So the three areas that we're focusing on: buildings, energy networks, and transport, which are major areas of persistent greenhouse gas emissions, and they are the major areas in which these existing bundles of projects actually exist within these cities. And as I say, a transition platform is a user-oriented arena of practice. It's not defined by a specific technology or technological solution. It is simply, what are the prospects for a low-carbon transport system within this city? And as I say, the projects that they've received the resources for are often project-oriented, technology-driven, singular and solution-focused. So in Birmingham you'll have the fuel cell experts and getting projects to develop those. And we're trying to think, well, how could you fit that into a notion of a transition experiment? And so that's about clustering within arenas. So I'll draw, so the systems here, so energy efficiency through design or retrofit, so you can have system changes about the system for financing and supporting that. You can have changes in the active management of demand for energy consumption. And there are similar system changes in the other areas. So, in conclusion, this is part of a process of seeking to encourage the municipal actor to become much more aware that they have a particular role in system innovation, and through that, it seems to me, we have the potential for perhaps making a more decisive shift to that type of challenge-led social transformation, innovation policy than we have so far managed. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much.